All right, welcome everyone to our COVID-19 Know Your Rights and Prepare webinar. I know that there is a bunch of people still logging on, and hopefully we will get started in about a minute or two. While we're doing that, I wanted to introduce the presentation and introduce the presenter and get started. As always, we are recording these webinars, and the PowerPoint and the recording will be made available once we archive it. So today's webinar, I'm really thinking about people with intellectual and developmental disabilities who live in residential facilities and group homes, or even those who are able to live independently. COVID poses a significant risk. Preparing people with intellectual disabilities for medical treatment, understanding the law, asking for reasonable accommodation, and planning for illness at home are some ways to ensure appropriate and equitable health care. We today are going to be presenting or covering the following items. Getting equitable health care is the law. Reasonable accommodations, what you need to know. Who to ask and when. Reasonable accommodations to ask for. Make a plan for sickness at home, and don't neglect mental well-being. I wanted to introduce Melissa Desroches. She's a registered nurse and postdoctoral research fellow at Tufts University. The mission of her program of research is to improve the health and wellness and quality of life of adults with developmental disabilities by improving developmental disability nursing care. Her current research project examines nurses' attitudes and emotions towards caring for adults with intellectual disabilities in the U.S. Melissa, welcome. Welcome again. I'm going to pass the presentation to you, and you can get started.
Thank you so much, Jasmina and Beth. Moving along here. So Jasmina was kind enough to provide an introduction, and there's just a couple points I want to mention about why I'm speaking to you about this topic today. So first is that I kind of sit in two worlds. I'm a developmental disabilities nurse, but I've also grown up in nursing as a critical care nurse and a perioperative nurse. And critical care is what we're seeing in the news now, people on ventilators, care rationing. So I'm able to see both sides of what's going on here, both from a disability and from a critical care perspective. I'd also like to point out and thank the Developmental Disability Nurses Association for supporting work related to COVID-19 from a disability perspective. And if there are any disability nurses that are on this call that are not already members of DDNA, I welcome you to visit ddna.org to become more involved, as this is a great way that we can advocate together as a group for the critical needs of people with developmental disabilities right now during the COVID-19 crisis. So I'd like to start with a disclaimer that I am not a medical doctor, nor am I a lawyer. So the information in this webinar is really for educational purposes. It's not legal or medical counsel. Likewise, all of the information is in the public domain, and there's a handout that I provide that shows all of the different sources, and you can get this information directly should you like to cite it in any way. So Jasmina mentioned what we're going to be talking about today, and we'll dig right in with getting equitable healthcare is the law. So equitable healthcare is the law according to many different laws, multiple laws. Virtually all healthcare providers in the U.S. are subject to these disability non-discrimination mandates. And this includes mandates that healthcare providers and facilities that accept any federal financial assistance, including Medicare and Medicaid reimbursements, which are most providers and facilities, they're covered by Section 504 of the Rehabilitation Act, so meaning they are not permitted to discriminate. Likewise, medical providers' offices and hospitals that are operated by state or local governments, they're subject to Title II of the Americans with Disabilities Act. Any private medical providers, offices, and hospitals are subject to Title III of the Americans with Disabilities Act. And this classifies these private healthcare services as something called a public accommodation, which means it's basically a public good or a service, and it doesn't matter whether or not federal finances are received you must not discriminate. Lastly, any healthcare programs and activities, again, that accept federal financial assistance, including most private healthcare providers and insurance companies, are subject to Section 1557 of the Affordable Care Act. So we see multiple laws and provisions that protect the health care of people with disabilities and prohibit discrimination against a wide variety of contexts. It's been careful that we cover every context, whether public or private, whether accepting federal funding or not, and this includes healthcare services. So there's a great legal precedent of non-discrimination. So what is equitable healthcare? When we talk about having healthcare that's equitable, it's not discriminatory. So we're talking about having healthcare that is equal in accessibility, availability, and quality as to somebody that does not have a disability. And these healthcare laws prohibit discrimination, outright discrimination, but it also prohibits more subtle forms of inequity, such as providing care that was thoughtless, or we just didn't think about the needs of a person with disability as being any different, or being indifferent and not caring enough to provide sensitive disability care, as well as just neglecting needs, something they call benign neglect, not paying any attention to it at all. So here, it's not just having that really blatant discrimination, but it protects against much more subtle discrimination as well. Discrimination also according to other case law. So what case law means is we have certain laws that we reviewed at the beginning, but we also have legal precedent because of different cases, different lawsuits, and the findings of different lawsuits. And you can see that there's also regulations, which are how laws are interpreted. So we have multiple different ways that discrimination is prohibited in addition to the laws that are passed. And here in the regulations, we see discrimination defined as providing an aid, a benefit, or a service that is not as effective in affording equal opportunity to get the same result, to get the same benefit, or to reach the same level of achievement that is provided to people without disabilities. So it's very clearly defined. Discrimination is also considered, and it's important here given how we're having screening criteria for care rationing, discrimination is eligibility criteria that screen out or tend to screen out an individual with a disability or any class of individuals with disabilities from fully and equally enjoying any service, program, or activity. So if we are screening out people from receiving ventilators based on having a disability, this is outright against the law. Here is something very important, and this is why it is in red and it is in bold. No provision in the Americans with Disabilities Act, Section 504 of the Rehab Act, or Section 1557 of the Affordable Care Act, nor in any other federal law authorizes the waiver of any of these requirements during a public health emergency. So the civil rights of people with disabilities do not disappear because we are in a global pandemic. They do not disappear because we are in a national crisis. The rights remain. None of this goes away. Because of challenges that were being seen and outright poor rationing decisions that put people with disabilities and others at risk, the Office of Civil Rights released a bulletin on March 28th that explicitly stated, as such, persons with disabilities should not be denied medical care on the basis of stereotypes, assessments of quality of life, or judgments about a person's relative worth based on the presence or absence of disabilities or age. Decisions for treatment should be based on an individualized assessment of the patient based on the best available objective medical evidence. What's important to note here is that there was enough negativity and enough problems with the way we were approaching care during COVID-19 for people with disabilities that the Office of Civil Rights was needing to put out this bulletin. So in other words, there was a great need to fight against a tide of discrimination towards people with disabilities. There is bias that persists to this day towards people with disabilities, and it is imperative that we as advocates reach out together to the best of our abilities to protect the civil rights of people with disabilities. As a critical care nurse and as a disability nurse now, I have firsthand seen how assessments of quality of life impact people with disabilities. On a day-to-day basis, nurses and doctors work together based on what they believe is in the best interests of the patient. They look at things like their survival, their potential for survival, and ultimately every day consider what is the impact on quality of life. And based on these thoughts, they make recommendations to family members and guardians. And these recommendations are often whether or not to continue or not life-saving and life-sustaining measures. So on a regular basis, healthcare providers' quality of life assessments influence decision-making and influence the menu of options that are offered to people with and without disabilities. But for people with disabilities, we know that medical professionals do not do a good job at evaluating the quality of life with people with disabilities. Much research has shown that people with disabilities evaluate their quality of life as much higher than that medical professionals do. So this is entirely worrisome, and evidently worrisome enough that groups came together and the Office of Civil Rights put forth this bulletin, addressing the fact that we need to base our assessment and judgments of care on individualized assessment of the patient, based on objective medical evidence and not on quality of life or a value of life based on disability or age. So in terms of rights, what are healthcare rights for people with disabilities? People with disabilities have full and equal access. They're entitled to full and equal access to healthcare services and facilities. That includes the use of life-sustaining measures, intensive care services, treatment, and follow-up. Another right that is in place as the result of the Americans with Disabilities Act is reasonable accommodations. And this means that there can be exceptions to usual policies made based on an individual's needs. So some of these adjustments may relate to policies or common practices and procedures when necessary to make sure that these healthcare services are fully available to individuals with disabilities. There is a caveat unless the modifications would fundamentally alter the nature of the service or put undue burden. But in general, the precedent is there that we need to accommodate and adjust to make services readily and equally available to people with disabilities. This is the law. So how do we ask for these reasonable accommodations? Well, the first step really is you need to think about what they would be. So when you are going to see a healthcare provider with an individual that you support, what type of adjustments would you be asking for? And in the subsequent slides, we'll be talking about different accommodations that you can request. But once you identify what these accommodations are, it's important that you ask for the reasonable accommodation from the very beginning. And oftentimes, we recommend that you do this if you're going into a provider's office, that you call ahead of time so that they have the opportunity to get the equipment or the interpreter or whatever is needed. But obviously, not everything is planned. Life gives us surprises. So from the earliest opportunity that you have, to ask for reasonable accommodations, as well as at every opportunity. It's important because any member of the staff, not just the medical team, anybody that you encounter in a hospital or any other healthcare setting is required to help with a reasonable accommodation, regardless of the role. And it's important that this be considered an ongoing process rather than a one-time request. Do not assume that because you've asked and because somebody told you that this is all set, that it's taken care of. There is very little to no training on disability rights or on the needs of people with disabilities in healthcare settings for doctors and nurses. So doctors and nurses are really ill-prepared to understand what a reasonable accommodation is and that they are actually mandated by law to provide them. So there is some education often that needs to be done surrounding reasonable accommodations in terms of the fact that these aren't just nice things that we're asking for, but these are the individual's rights. And because people are not aware of the need for reasonable accommodations, it may be an ongoing educational process throughout the healthcare encounter, which can be challenging when we don't have a support person with the individual at the bedside, which is another reason that we're promoting that as a reasonable accommodation to ask for. So again, reasonable accommodations to ask for. So it's important that as much as is possible, that a support person is allowed to remain with the individual and be provided with personal protective equipment. So obviously, we have seen the challenges with obtaining personal protective equipment here in the U.S. I think we are making some headway with this. In Massachusetts, we are seeing sterilization of PPE so that it's becoming more available as it's able to be reused. I did see on Facebook today with a colleague that Rush University, their medical center, has implemented a policy that allows a support person to remain with the individual with a disability throughout their hospitalization. And it's important to recognize that at this point, I believe this is a decision made on an organization-to-organization basis. So understanding what facility is around you that may allow you to accompany the person you support or not may be a wise choice of something to look into. But again, it's important to know that this is a reasonable accommodation to ask for and that there is a legal precedent to be able to ask for this. Another reasonable accommodation that's very important is asking for and understanding what is the triage protocol in terms of who can have a ventilator and how long someone can remain on a ventilator if needed, and how are we screening to decide who gets this ventilator and critical care. We know that people with disabilities often have underlying conditions, and perhaps they just need a little bit longer on a ventilator than a person without a disability. And certain screening tools that are in place in Massachusetts, for example, use somebody's functional abilities before being hospitalized as a measure, or they use a scale that looks at verbal ability or level of consciousness. So asking for reasonable modifications to screening for critical care rationing and asking for somebody for a reasonable accommodation to be able to stay on a ventilator a little while longer is a reasonable modification. These legal rights to have reasonable modifications do not go away during a crisis, and that's important to be able to state clearly if you need to advocate for these reasonable accommodations. Another reasonable accommodation is, again, asking to see the triage decisions and appealing when appropriate. There is, as I mentioned before, a level of bias against people with disabilities. Sometimes this is outright, and sometimes this is implicit, which means it's not on the consciousness of the healthcare provider, that it's something that they don't recognize. But asking to see the triage decisions will help to make that clear if if the decisions were based on objective medical evidence or if they were based on judgments about long-term survival or quality of life. And so it's perfectly acceptable to ask to see the triage decisions and to appeal the decisions when appropriate. And we'll talk about how to do that shortly. Other reasonable accommodations. It is not unrealistic to ask providers to speak clearly and communicate in a way that the individual understands. I understand that time is short. I've been a critical care nurse. I understand that right now it is a crisis and there is a shortage, but that makes it even more important that the communication that we use is effective to convey the information to the person in a way that makes sense so that we can explain this and the individual will understand. So clear communication in a way the individual understands is a legal right, as well as accommodating how the individual communicates. So what is communicated as well as how it is communicated. Making sure that a person has access to their letterboard or having the iPad being charged and within reach at all times. Sometimes healthcare facilities don't want to take responsibility for a valuable like an iPad or being responsible for charging it. And if the individual is on a ventilator or has intensive medical challenges, it's not that they're going to be able to do this on their own, if they're even intellectually able to remember to charge their iPad. So making a reasonable accommodation that this isn't just for entertainment, this is the person's communication, and it's important that the devices that the individual is using are at the bedside and are actually being used. I have supported individuals in the hospital before and seen from shift to shift how communication devices are put in the drawer or put away, and what a world of a difference it makes when an individual is able to communicate, not only for the individual's sake to communicate, but for the staff's perception that that person has some quality to their life. Not being able to communicate, people assume that not much is going on intellectually. But what a change communication makes in staff perception of people's lives when they're able to communicate. Another reasonable accommodation that's important is taking extra time to listen to the individual. Three major reasonable accommodations are time, communication, and information, if we had to sum them up. And time is obviously of the essence right now. But there's an old adage that it takes time to save time. And what we can do and what we can understand by listening to an individual and understanding their needs can prevent a lot of fear, anxiety, and resulting behavioral challenges. So asking that extra time be taken to listen to the individual is extremely important. In addition, I mentioned information. So providing information that is accessible. How is an individual consuming information? What is the best manner for the individual to learn about their condition related to COVID-19 or any condition, and what steps they need to stay safe? Part of the survey that I've recently worked with, a team of us at the Developmental Disability Nurses Association, the early findings are showing that there's a lack of information available for people with disabilities to help them understand why they need to be socially distant and why they can't go out and do their usual activities and what's going on. And if healthcare providers are going to be teaching individuals about this, it's important that they're able to give this information in a way that is accessible. And that's not on the disability community to adapt that information. That's on healthcare to provide this in an acceptable format from the get-go. Other reasonable accommodations to ask for. It's very difficult, as you're aware, when somebody right now with a disability goes into the hospital. We know that in not all cases is a supportive staff person or caregiver allowed to go in. And again, that's a reasonable accommodation that we request. It's not always granted. What's very important in the event that this is granted or not is that the medical team know to work very closely with whoever the care team is related to self-determination and supported decision-making. So making sure that the medical team isn't making decisions on their own for the individual, but that the individual is offered self-determination, or I shouldn't say offered, but has self-determination to make their choices and to be supported by their decision-making team. If they are not able to make their own choices meaningfully, then it's important that the medical team work closely with the guardian and the advocates. And part of how this is done, and I recommend, is just making continual contact, not waiting for the medical team to reach out to you, but being a presence, if it's by telephone, by email, however the communication is going, but to make sure that the medical team knows that there is a group that cares deeply about this person and cares about their well-being. A reasonable accommodation, providing a quiet space to wait and be examined. So we think of ERs, we know they are busy, bustling places, and oftentimes we avoid them if we can try, especially now. That being said, it's not a good thing when we are not able to get care that we need because we're afraid of going to the emergency room. But we can request, when we do need to go right now, a quiet space to wait and be examined, and there is legal backing there. It's not just obviously because we want quiet, but because the individual may not tolerate being in that very sensory laden space. So that is something that we can request, as well as the use of special equipment as needed. So I have heard and I have seen that there are times when we're not getting people onto examination tables to be physically examined, and the assessments are performed in the wheelchair, or they're performed half-heartedly because we don't have the equipment to get somebody up, or that the equipment is 2 floors ahead and it'll take too long to get the special lift or whatever it is. No, the person has the right to have the use of special equipment so that they can get care that is equal and equitable in terms of what a person without a disability would have. So that is not an excuse for special equipment not to be used. In addition, during this time, because of shortages related to medications and equipment, including ventilators and respiratory equipment, you may consider bringing your own medications and equipment as needed. And this may be something that you arrange ahead of time. However, there have been some instances where states have discussed reallocating even ventilators from people who have disabilities to somebody else who they feel may have a greater likelihood of surviving, even though that is the own personal equipment of the person with a disability. So if you do choose to bring anything in to the hospital, make sure that it is clearly labeled personal property. Do not reallocate. And again, this is something you may want to look at ahead of time in terms of bringing own medications, as oftentimes there are policies against this. But in a crisis time with a shortage of medications, this may be something that is revisited from an organization to organization basis. So we have many things that we can ask for. And once we ask for them, it's really, there is no agency, let me say, that goes out and polices whether these requests are granted. There is no organization that is going out and routinely surveying the community to make sure that it is disability accessible. The Americans with Disabilities Act, in general, is reliant upon people bringing it to the attention of the Office of Civil Rights. And that's ultimately where you would file a complaint, would be with the Office of Civil Rights. But before you take it to that level, there are steps that you can follow. So the first is to speak up as soon as you can. If you feel that your rights are being violated as a person with a disability, or that the rights of a person that you support are being violated, speak up as soon as you can to the person whom you feel is responsible for violating the rights. And you can show them the legal references. You can show them the laws, the Americans with Disabilities Act, Section 504 of the Rehabilitation Act, Section 1557 of the Affordable Care Act. You can show them the legal precedent. And in the resources handout, there are some great brief summaries of these laws. At the bottom of this slide here, the citation that I give is the Communication First COVID-19 Toolkit, and they break it down. You could even cut it into a little card, and it's something that you can very easily show somebody. As well as giving them an actual copy of the Civil Rights Bulletin that came out during this COVID-19 crisis. It's about 2 pages. It's not too much to read. You can highlight the parts that speak about disability discrimination. So part of it, I really do believe, is a lack of knowledge. When I was a perioperative nurse and a critical care nurse, I did not know that people had the legal right to a sign language interpreter. I thought, well, the person has a hearing impairment. They need to bring an interpreter with them. Wrong. There are laws that give people these rights, but even well-intentioned nurses and doctors do not know this. So educate. It's awful to put this on the community of people with disabilities to have to educate, and we do have movements where we are trying to promote disability education and healthcare. The Alliance for Disability Healthcare Education is one organization, but also at this time, because of how important this is, we do ask that with a grassroots effort to speak for yourselves, speak up to protect your own rights during this time. You can also point the offending party, in your opinion, to the hospital. They should have a web page or some information in the patient handbook. I looked at my local hospital system, and there is information in the patient handbook about disability discrimination, and show them what it actually says on their own hospital website or in that handbook. If that is not helping, each hospital also has a patient relation office, whether it's patient experience, patient relations, patient care services, or somebody that is a rights coordinator, either civil rights or human rights. You could reach out to both of these offices and discuss your concerns. And oftentimes that's about as high as you need to take it because people generally they're not wanting to rock the boat. These people tend to know about, as part of their education, what rights people have related to disability. However, if needed, you can file a grievance. And you can ask these groups to help you with that. If necessary, at that point, you can also, and if time is of the essence, you can also file a complaint with the U.S. Department of Health and Human Services, the Office for Civil Rights. And you can see the link here. It's on the web, and this is where you can file a complaint. And they do speak to the fact now that with COVID-19, they understand that people will be filing complaints. And I believe the Bulletin discusses this as well that they put out. So all of this being said is talking about hospitalization. But one of the major things that we can do to protect health is to try to avoid hospitalization if necessary. Now, I'm not saying when you need care not to seek it. But what I'm saying is that there are some preventative actions that we can take to help us so that we may not need hospital level care. So what can we do? We can make a plan ahead of time. Now, some individuals, for example, have seizures that are induced by fever, and we know some symptoms associated with COVID are fever. So if we can call ahead of time and ask providers for a special dose of seizure medication that perhaps can be increased if the individual has a fever, that may help us from not needing to seek hospital care just related to the seizure that goes along with the fever. So contacting the healthcare provider ahead of time and discussing this before this becomes an issue is something that can save you headache in the long run and save you a trip to the hospital. The other thing to think about is what provider would be your first point of contact if the individual that you support becomes ill, and where would testing occur? So how would we go about this if the individual were to become ill, and what provider would ultimately be making the decisions? In addition, it's important to consider caregivers and making sure that there's a backup plan in place in the event you as the caregiver become ill. And this could be in terms of an informal caregiver or a family caregiver, as well as a personal care attendant that comes into the home, or in general staffing in a group home. But there needs to be a plan in place, because what happens is, as I'm sure you know, familiar caregivers, they know the little things, especially during this anxiety-laden time, that can really help somebody cope. And having unfamiliar caregivers and not knowing what's going on can also pose an additional challenge that can stress the individual. So making a plan in terms of if somebody were to become ill, if you were to become ill as the caregiver, how would you handle this? Would the person that you care for, whether it's your son, daughter, sibling, foster child, how would you handle this? Would you stay in the home and the individual would go elsewhere? Would you stay in your bedroom? You have to think about things. Are there separate bathrooms? Who would be coming into the home? So making a plan, and it'll vary from individual situation to individual situation. But additionally, what we're also finding in our DD nursing study, as well as speaking with different advocates, is the challenge with behaviors right now. Obviously, the world has completely been shook up for all of us, but including the people with disabilities that we support. And one of the primary ways that anxiety is managed is through different behaviors that can be soothing to the individual, but entirely challenging when you're the caregiver. I've seen on Facebook different friends and advocates having challenges with food denial, and their children perceiving that they're denying them food, and the needing to have food all around them for security. And making a plan with your backup caregivers as to how they would address this and making them aware of this, as well as making a plan in general about how you may address this can be helpful, but just giving yourself a measure of grace to also recognize that this is probably something that you're not going to be able to 100% get a perfect plan, because we're all just flying by the seat of our pants doing the best we can. That being said, another good idea is to look ahead of time at what agencies could support you in the event that somebody in your household becomes ill. Who could be delivering food? Is there a need for mental health counseling, and can we continue that remotely? Are there remote options for that? What resources are available in terms of respite staffing, things like that? So looking ahead at how we can make a plan ahead of time is important. If we do need to go to the hospital, it's important that we're really plastering providers with the information that is relevant and important. And I recommend making multiple copies, putting them in the chart, putting them in the room, putting them multiple places. I see things disappear. And when things are tucked away in a chart, even our case records from the developmental services, state records, I see them not looked at. And what's really looked at is what's at the bedside. Now, again, that's challenging if we're not able to accompany people in. But if a support person is allowed, I highly recommend making things clear and visible on the walls, on the bedside table. There are some great resources that are out there right now. A professor at Stony Brook pulled together forms state by state of all crucial information that a healthcare provider would need to know about caring for a person with disability. So you can click that state by state, and the forms will be there according also to what each state requests in terms of information from individuals. She's already done all that background work and pulled that together. In addition, having power of attorney or guardianship papers as well is very important, as always. Anything that talks about communication and how individuals communicate, extremely important. Communication first has resources available that are printable. There are different documents, and there's also informational sheets for healthcare providers and other informational resources that they can use. I believe it's been updated specifically for COVID-19, but there are many resources available as well. Oh, I see the links up in the chat. Good. There's also a movement called #NobodyIsDisposable, and it started, I believe, in the UK. I could be wrong. I believe it started in the UK, and the idea is self-advocacy in terms of disability, and this is also related to fat shaming and obesity. But there's great resources there. There's a letter to provider staff that thanks them for the work that they're doing and just reminds them that my life has quality and value and I want treatment. So having a letter that you can share with providers is another option as well. Providing a copy of legal rights. Again, having that face-to-face where the individual with a healthcare provider can see it is very important because many are not aware. And even just knowing that there's somebody there that knows about legal rights, that can prompt a greater awareness. As always, when we are healthcare providers caring for somebody in the hospital setting, whether you have a disability or not, we are seeing people on their worst days. And sometimes it is very hard to imagine how somebody else could look, act, or behave otherwise. We have very little to go off of. We've taken people out of their everyday situations, we've put them in their Johnnies, and now we've even taken away support people during COVID-19. Hopefully we're getting that back with our rights. But it's very important that healthcare providers have a way to see the individual looking like a human being, doing something that they enjoy, that they have a good quality of life. So including a photo with this information in any way that you can, being creative in how you're able to humanize the individual that you serve will do a lot towards promoting positive perceptions of the person's quality of life. It's also important to send in any communication tools as well as instructions. And oftentimes if you can tape the instructions right to the communication tools so they don't get lost anywhere, that they are right there and available, chargers, as well as any batteries, all in with the individual's name. And I would also put do not reallocate. This also includes eyeglasses, hearing aids, any adaptive equipment. I've said it before, but it's very important when it looks like somebody can't communicate or they can't understand what you're saying. It oftentimes looks like that person doesn't have the capacity to understand or to communicate, when in reality, maybe it's just that the hearing aids are not in. They're not hearing you and they're not able to see you. So making sure that we are able to optimize the individual's abilities while they are present in the healthcare setting will go a long way. So making sure that we send everything that we can. Again, we mentioned consider bringing your own medications and equipment, but that again, from organization to organization, they have different policies, but even asking ahead, do you have the proper medications for this individual? Should I send certain medications in or equipment? And what is the policy on reallocation? That would be important to know. Sending cards, pictures, and photos. This is something that we can do, and I don't believe COVID-19 is interfering with. If anybody knows otherwise, I would like to know. But the idea is if we can send cards, pictures, and photos from as many people as we can, and including photos of the individuals doing things that they enjoy and remember. It will not only just cheer up the individual, but really it'll do to show healthcare providers that this individual has worth, and this individual has value, and this individual is cared for. And this is hugely important as it changes perceptions about quality of life and about the value of the person sitting in that bed. Because even if we're not openly discriminatory towards individuals with disability, there is that implicit bias where we associate disability with less or defective or not as good, even though we don't mean to. It's part of the ableism in our society, and we do need to fight it. And this is one key way, one easy way that we can do this. If you are the contact person for the individual, oftentimes we request that there is one contact person so that we're not all bombarding telephone calls to the unit. Make sure that you call every shift, because this will make it aware to every nurse, every person that's caring for the individual, that there is somebody there looking out and that cares about this person. Lastly, there are human rights issues associated with this in a non-crisis time. If you are able to make your own decisions and you would like to, you can write on your chest with Sharpie, I want life-saving measures. And Nobody is Disposable suggests this because ultimately the last thing, the last layer of protection that we have is our own bodies. When you take away the communication and you take away the charts and the letters, we have our bodies. So just making sure that the message written on the chest matches whatever is sent in terms of advanced directives, but that this is something you may consider in your particular situation. With all of this being said, it's obviously very stressful, and these are unprecedented times, and that's a lot of information and a lot to put on people who are already hugely stressed in a day-to-day situation. So just taking a lens and stepping back for a moment and remembering that although many of us are home, or the individuals that we support are in their homes and not in day hab settings, this isn't vacation. This isn't time when we say, we're going to have all this time to clean out our closets and pick up a new hobby. And no, it's okay just to get through each day and survive. That's okay. The expectations for ourselves and for the individuals we support, we can lower them right now, and it's okay. Maintaining a routine as much as possible is extremely helpful. Routines for everybody tend to be stabilizing, and we have shook up many aspects of routine right now. So giving yourself a break on your expectations, but still trying to stick to some type of routine for ourselves and for the individuals we support tends to be helpful for mental health. As well as pulling away from the incessant reading, watching, or listening to the news. This can be stressful to us. This can be stressful for the people that we support, taking a break from the news. And staying connected is hugely important. One of the findings from the study that we're working on right now as part of DDNA so far, and just the raw data, is how important it is to stay connected with others, and how really this is a huge challenge as we support people with disabilities, that making sure people are able to stay connected. People may not be able to come in and visit anymore because of social distancing, but making sure that people have the opportunity to talk on the phone or to email or to Skype or however it is that people are staying connected is hugely important. And it's okay to share your concerns about how you are feeling. It doesn't make you weak. And although you may be healthy and you don't have COVID and you feel guilty about feeling negatively when you are well, it's okay to feel badly right now. And asking for help, not being afraid to reach out, it doesn't make you weak. Getting in some physical activity, both for us and for the people we support, is hugely important. It helps to burn off steam. It helps to burn off some of that extra mental energy. So it doesn't have to be any formal exercise program. When I worked with people with disabilities in the community, we talked about different ways we could get physically active when we couldn't go out. Dancing, even if it's upper body, whatever it is. Some have mentioned when it's appropriate, tickling is a great way to burn off some steam. So, you know, with my kids every day, we can roughhouse a little and have some fun, stay safe, get physically active. That's a good thing. And lastly, practicing gratitude and positive thinking. And it really is a practice trying to look at, with you and with the people that you support, what are 3 things that we can be thankful for today? Yeah, a lot has changed right now, but what do we have to be thankful for? And how can we practice positive thinking on a daily basis? So that is the end of the presentation today. There is a handout of resources, and I think I've seen that as I've been speaking. Oh yeah, the resources have been coming up. So I appreciate your time today. Jasmina, I'm not sure if we have time for any questions, but I'm available.
Thank you so much, Melissa. We do have we have about 10 minutes for questions. I wanted to just put out a couple of comments that were coming through as you were presenting. A couple of comments came from Cheryl. She said she works for a state Medicaid waiver, and this is about hospitalization and sort of like thinking through the rights. We're working with CMS to get approval for people's DSPs to be able to get paid if they stay with someone who has been admitted. Please check with your state to see if waiver regulations have changed recently. And she also said it's in our waivers Appendix K. Every state should have their own Appendix K. And then another comment from Cheryl was if someone's rights are being violated, they should also contact their state's protection and advocacy agency for people with disabilities. Go to ndrn.org to find yours. I will put that website in the chat. I've been having lots of questions through chat and through the question and answer box. Also, the couple of resources that Melissa was mentioning, we will make those available along with the PowerPoints and the recording, and you will be emailed once those materials are archived, and you'll be able to go to our HealthMatters website to download them. So a couple of questions. So feel free to put in your questions in either question and answer box or the chat box. But let me just find a few questions and we can get going here. Sorry, there's just so many. One of the questions was from Edna. How do these rights come into play if they decide to take an older disabled person off a ventilator and give it to a younger non-disabled person?
These rights come into play because it needs to be clear how that decision was made. If the decision was made just on the basis of disability and age, that's a civil rights violation. If the decision was made based on this person's specific medical criteria, meaning, do we think that they can survive this particular illness, this particular acute respiratory distress syndrome, and that's what the key criterion was to make the decision, then that's what happens, and then that's an appropriate decision. But there are a great number of factors that can be considered, and it needs to be based on those objective medical factors and not related to overall judgments about disability and age. So that's not to say that if care rationing had to happen in a particular situation, that it would be a civil rights violation for a person with a disability not to receive a ventilator. That wouldn't be true, because there may be some situations in which that person has such an acute illness that their survival wouldn't be likely. But what I am saying is that if we do not look at individualized objective medical evidence, and instead we look at disability as a label or age as a label or even the diagnosis as a label, in terms of Down syndrome, for instance, just because somebody has Down syndrome doesn't mean they necessarily have any health conditions that go along with that make them any less healthy or likely to survive than anybody else. So if we make a judgment based on diagnosis, then we're discriminating. What we need to do is look at that short-term survivability and in terms of what is the objective medical evidence and not disability label or age as a whole. I hope that made that more clear, and if not, I can try to elaborate a little bit more.
Thank you, Melissa. Here's another kind of follow-up question to that. Wondering if a person with an intellectual or developmental disability can still have a personal care attendant or family member remain or visit them in the hospital as an accommodation. What if they are not hospitalized and they don't have COVID-19? So I'm assuming it's at this point in time.
Accommodation. So one of the challenges, and I think it was Cheryl that brought it up, one of the challenges that across states, funding is ultimately a challenge in terms of who pays for having that supportive caregiver at the bedside. So usually when one's in the hospital, it's one funding stream. When one is out of the hospital, it is a different funding stream. So who's paying for what is often a challenge. But allowing the person to be at the bedside would be the reasonable accommodation. So in this case, if you're the agency that is trying to provide the person at the bedside and that's being denied, that would be when you're asking, no, this is a reasonable accommodation for disability, not just because, we want a support person there. So in a non-COVID time, I would say that's challenging anyway based on funding, but it's always something to be aware of in terms of who are you asking for, whether it be the hospital or the provider agency. I can speak for the state where I am in. If one is in the hospital, it is the hospital's is the person required for funding, and so oftentimes the agencies will try to send somebody in, but they're actually not being reimbursed to send a support staff in because the hospital is getting the funding. So it can be a huge challenge with funding, but I know it also does vary state to state. But really the idea is that it's like an accommodation to allow the person, but in terms of who's funding it, that's a whole nother issue.
Thanks, Melissa. And this may kind of come, it's kind of in the same realm, thinking about telehealth and any resources or a hotline for DSPs or parents who are at home and struggling with care issues. So have you heard of any resources for telehealth and this population in particular?
So I know at this point, I mean, I can really only speak to the state that I'm in. I haven't heard of any national resources, but what our state is recommending is that you get in touch with the state level resources. I know in Massachusetts, we do have a hotline for children with special health care needs. Many individuals who are adults were asking them to get in contact with the Department of Developmental Services because of some of their reimbursements have changed based on COVID-19 and the hours have changed. That's allowable. So I would say look probably on a state level, but off the top of my head, no. I do know that the ARC is doing a lot in terms of surveying. So the ARC is always a good resource to get in touch with, but I'm not aware of any like widespread campaigns in terms of telehealth. I would say reach out to your state ARC branch for more information. They'd probably best be able to help you with that.
Thank you. Any other questions from the group? Please let us know, or even any comments or anything that you would like to share or what's going on in your state. It would be extremely helpful. We're going to stick around for a couple more minutes to see if there are any questions. Again, we've recorded the webinar. We'll make all the websites, the resources available. We're having someone, Joel has just commented, all telehealth and telephonic services have specific codes which apply state to state. Best advice is to contact your state's DHHS. Thanks. Thank you, Joel. All right, we'll stick around. Thank you very much for attending this webinar. We will continue through HealthMatters to share most up-to-date COVID information via email, and hopefully we will be able to provide some additional webinars in a short while. Thank you again. We'll stick around, Melissa and I, to see if there are any more questions. The recording pops out maybe within 24 hours, so I'm going to try to get it out to everyone within the next day or two. So thank you, and have a great rest of the day. Thank you so much, Melissa, too. This was really important and informational and interesting.
Thank both you and Beth. Thank you, Jasmina and Beth, for the opportunity to share this with the group.
Anytime. All right, I don't think there are any more questions coming through, so we can conclude it. Thanks, Melissa, again.
Okay. Thank you again. Take care. Stay well.
You too. Bye.
Bye.